welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. This week, our subject is Queen Elizabeth I. Back to Queen Elizabeth I. She was 25 and in love. She was in love with her childhood friend, Robert Dudley. The problem being that Robert Dudley was already married to his wife, Amy. For the next year and a half, Elizabeth was in love with Dudley. And Dudley, whose wife was said to be sick, was entertaining making Queen Elizabeth his second wife. They just had to wait until Amy died. Queen Elizabeth's advisors were telling her that this was a bad idea and pushing her to other political marriages. She seemed to have interest in no one except Dudley. The following year, Amy did die, but she didn't die from the illness that she reportedly had. She died from falling down a flight of stairs. The coroner declared it a fatal accident, but people were sus. Did Dudley kill his wife so he could marry the queen? Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe she fell. Maybe she was pushed. But Elizabeth couldn't risk people turning on her. Anyway, death in an accident meant that she could not marry Dudley without risking her crown and her life. And Elizabeth had learned to be very, very careful. Dudley stayed in her life, and they kept their relationship, but it could never be public or official in any way. He married nearly 20 years later, and Queen Elizabeth hated his wife for the rest of her life. Her brother-in-law, King Philip of Spain, proposed, but she turned him down. King Eric XIV of Sweden also proposed, and that was an option she considered for nearly a decade, but she never followed through with it. Danish Prince Adolf and Prince Frederick, later Frederick II, several years later were also considered, but the negotiations fell through. For several years, she also seriously negotiated to marry Charles II, Archduke of Austria. By 1569, relations with the Habsburgs had deteriorated. Elizabeth considered marriage to two French Valois princes in turn. First, Henry, Duke of Anjou, and then, from 1572 to 1581, his brother, Francois, Duke of Anjou. Elizabeth seems to have taken the courtship seriously, and for a time, she wore a frog-shaped earring that Francois had sent her. In 1563, Elizabeth told an imperial envoy, "If I follow the inclination of my nature, it is this: beggar, woman, and single, far rather than queen and married." Later in the year, following Elizabeth's illness with smallpox, the succession question became a heated issue in Parliament. Had she died of smallpox, as a lot of people had, they would have had a succession crisis. She still had no heir, but she survived and had smallpox scars for the rest of her life. At this time, she was 30. She used makeup to cover them up, poison makeup, but it did the job. The queen was urged to marry or nominate an heir to prevent a civil war upon her death, but she refused to do either. She had promised to marry, but now she was like, "Look, if I find the right guy, I'll marry. But until then, you all need to chill out." By 1570, senior figures in the government privately accepted that Elizabeth would never marry or name a successor. For her failure to marry, Elizabeth was often accused of irresponsibility. Her silence, however, strengthened her own political security. She knew that if she named an heir, her throne would be vulnerable to a coup. She remembered the way that "a second person, as I have been," had been used as a focus of plots against her predecessor. Elizabeth's unmarried status inspired a cult of virginity related to that of the Virgin Mary. In poetry and portraiture, she was depicted as a virgin, a goddess, or both, not as a normal woman. At first, only Elizabeth made a virtue of her ostensible virginity. In 1559, she told the Commons, "And in the end this shall be for me sufficient, that a marble stone shall declare that a queen, having reigned such a time, lived and died a virgin." She was leaning into the narrative. Elizabeth would insist she was married to her kingdom and her subjects under divine protection. In 1599, she spoke of "all my husbands, my good people." This claim of virginity was not universally accepted. Catholics accused Elizabeth of engaging in filthy lust that symbolically defiled the nation along with her body. Henry IV of France said that one of the great questions of Europe was whether Queen Elizabeth was a maid or no. Her virginity was the topic of all the hot gossip all over Europe. A central issue when it comes to the question of Elizabeth's virginity was whether the Queen ever consummated her love affair with Robert Dudley. In 1559, she had Dudley's bedchambers moved next to her own apartments. In 1561, she was mysteriously bedridden with an illness that caused her body to swell. In 1587, a young man calling himself Arthur Dudley was arrested on the coast of Spain under suspicion of being a spy. The man claimed to be the illegitimate son of Elizabeth and Robert Dudley, with his age being consistent with birth during the 1561 illness. He was taken to Madrid for investigation. However, his story failed to convince the Spanish. Inglefield admitted to King Philip that Arthur's claim at present amounts to nothing, but suggested that he should not be allowed to get away, but kept very secure. The king agreed, and Arthur was never heard from again. Modern scholarship dismisses the story's basic premise as impossible and asserts that Elizabeth's life was so closely observed by contemporaries that she could not have hidden a pregnancy. Mary, Queen of Scots, was seen as the next possible heir to the throne. She was the granddaughter of Elizabeth's Aunt Margaret, but she was also the Queen of Scotland and married to the future King of France and Catholic. So that was seen as problematic. So Elizabeth decided to attempt to change Scotland from Catholic to Protestant. If her country was going to merge with Scotland, she at least wanted that country to be not Catholic. She sent forces to Scotland to aid the Protestant rebels. And then Mary, Queen of Scots' French husband died after only 2 years of marriage, and they never had children. Scotland was by now Protestant, and their queen was returning, a single, childless, Catholic queen. She had been living in France since she was a child. Mary, Queen of Scots, then made a series of poor choices. She married Lord Darnley, Henry Stuart, who himself had claimed the English throne. He too was the grandchild of Queen Elizabeth's Aunt Margaret. Mary and Henry were cousins, but they were stronger together than they were apart. Together, they had a baby named Prince James. This was a common name for Scottish royals. This baby would become the future King James VI. But then it was mad scandal time. Mary, Queen of Scots' husband, Henry, was murdered. The leader of the conspiracy to murder Henry was a man named James Hepburn. I know what you're thinking. Mary is totally going to kill him. But you'd be wrong. Queen Mary married him. So naturally, everyone assumed she was in on it. But this episode isn't about Mary, Queen of Scots. It's about Queen Elizabeth I. And she heard all about this drama, and she wrote Mary a letter. And the summary of the letter is this: How dumb are you to marry that guy? Everyone knows he killed your husband, and it makes you look guilty AF. Mary was then imprisoned and forced to abdicate in favor of her 1-year-old son, James, named after either his grandfather or his mother's boyfriend. Probably his grandfather, though. Mary, Queen of Scots, had been Queen of Scotland since she was 6 days old, and now she was a deposed 25-year-old Catholic former queen whose son was being raised, not by her, to be a Protestant. Mary escaped 2 years later. She fled to England, where she had hoped for help from Queen Elizabeth. At first, Queen Elizabeth wanted to help her cousin and fellow Queen Regnant, but upon further discussion with her advisors, she changed her mind. Queen Elizabeth kept Mary, Queen of Scots, imprisoned in England for the next 19 years. Mary was the figurehead for all the remaining Catholics. With both Scotland and England embracing Protestantism, the Catholics had no other hope other than to see Mary restored to the Scottish throne. But the rebels were defeated, and over 750 of them were executed on Elizabeth's orders. So she was chill about religion, until she really wasn't. In the belief that the revolt had been successful, Pope Pius V issued a bull titled Regnans in Excelsis, which declared Elizabeth, the pretend Queen of England, and the servant of crime, to be excommunicated, and a heretic, releasing all her subjects from any allegiance to her. Catholics who obeyed her orders were threatened with excommunication. So then the Protestants were like, nope, you've gone too far. It wasn't exactly illegal to be Catholic, but it was illegal to convert to Catholicism or to help someone else convert to Catholicism. And the punishment for that was death. It was not illegal to convert someone to Protestantism, so it was just a matter of time. Religion could only go in one direction legally. I think we need to take a moment to understand that this was Catholics and Protestants. Both followed the same Bible. Both believed in Jesus as the Savior. The main thing they disagreed on was the Pope, needed or not needed. That was the only real question. You would think they could get along with each other. Like, let's just agree to disagree about the Pope. But nope, they were back to killing each other. And this is why we can't have nice things, guys. In the 1570s, the Catholic Church in Europe sent secret spy priests to secretly reconvert England. A bunch of those guys were caught and executed. And all this time, the Catholics were chanting, "Free Mary, Queen of Scots." At first, Elizabeth resisted calls for Mary's death. But by late 1586, she had been persuaded to sanction Mary's trial and execution. On the 8th of February, 1587, Mary was beheaded in Northamptonshire. After the execution, Elizabeth claimed that she had not intended for the signed execution warrant to be dispatched and blamed her secretary for implementing it without her knowledge. But she'd signed it, so... Guys, after Mary Queen of Scots was beheaded, she said, "My bad, guys, clerical error." Both the people of her time and the people of our time didn't really believe she was sincere. Suitors kept coming until Elizabeth was 50. But then people decided, you know what, guys? I don't think she's going to get married. So around this time, Queen Elizabeth had a guy working for her, Sir Francis Drake. You may have heard of him. If you heard about him from the English, you would know him as an explorer who circumnavigated the globe when that was a much harder thing to do. If you heard about him from the Spanish, you would know him as Queen Elizabeth I's private pirate who had destroyed a fleet of Spanish ships. And if you heard about him from Forbes magazine, you would know him as number 2 on the top earning pirates list. He had the equivalent of 156.3 million US dollars today. And they are all correct. He was a very rich explorer pirate. Spain was still being ruled by her former brother-in-law, Philip, and he was livid. He declared war against his former sister-in-law, Elizabeth. And he was the proud owner of the Spanish Armada. The Spanish Armada couldn't lose. They didn't lose. They were kind of a big deal, but they did lose. The Armada was defeated by a combination of miscalculation, misfortune, and an attack of English ships. The Armada straggled home to Spain in shattered remnants after disastrous losses off the coast of Ireland. Unaware of the Armada's fate because no one brought their cell phone, English militias mustered to defend the country. Instead, they got Queen Elizabeth coming to inspect her troops. Wearing a silver breastplate over a white velvet dress, she addressed her people in one of her most famous speeches. "My loving people, we have been persuaded by some that are careful of our safety to take heed how we commit ourselves to armed multitudes for fear of treachery. But I assure you, I do not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people. I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too. And I think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare invade the borders of my realm." When no invasion came, the nation rejoiced. Elizabeth's procession to a Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's Cathedral rivaled that of her coronation as far as the spectacle goes. The defeat of the Armada was a potent propaganda victory, both for Elizabeth and for Protestant England. The English took their delivery as a symbol of God's favor and the nation's inviolability under a virgin queen. It was virgin magic. That's what defeated the Spanish Armada. However, the victory was not a turning point in the war, which continued and often favored Spain. They were still Spain. They were still good at war. The Spanish Armada was on a comeback tour. In 1589, France had its very first Protestant king when the Valois line ended and the crown passed to the Bourbon line of the royal family. Queen Elizabeth sent her fellow Protestant king, Henry IV of France, military support. That means that she had her military on both sides of the English Channel. Her brother-in-law was still waging war with her from Spain, and he wasn't happy about that. But lucky for him, idiots were in charge of her military in France, and they were kind of just a huge waste of time and money. Once her nobles were in France with an army, they decided they didn't need to listen to the queen. And they all did it, so she had no real recourse. In addition to being the Queen of England, Elizabeth was also the Queen of Ireland. Ireland had been her neglected kingdom for sure. It barely even entered into the equation. Ireland was so neglected that they were still Catholic. They were just kind of off on their own. Queen Elizabeth decided that Catholic Ireland was likely to help their fellow Catholics, the Spanish. Queen Elizabeth decided to go scorched earth, literally. They scorched the earth and killed all of the men, women, and children in their way. In 1582, an estimated 30,000 Irish people starved to death. Elizabeth advised her commanders that the Irish, that rude and barbarous nation, be well treated. But neither she nor her commanders showed any remorse when force and bloodshed had served their authoritarian purpose. In 1592, Queen Elizabeth was 59 years old, still unmarried and childless. Like Joan of Arc, she was leaning into her virgin reputation. She also used the possibility that she may still get married as a kind of foreign relations tactic. She was by now probably past her childbearing days, but that didn't make her less desirable. England didn't have an heir, and the Queen wouldn't be around much longer. Who would rule England after she passed? Ireland was unhappy. The Queen had not treated them well, and they were done. The 9 Years' War broke out. 9 Years' War because that's how long Queen Elizabeth had to live. The war ended upon her death. The Irish rebels, led by Hugh O'Neill, were being backed by Spain. Elizabeth's former brother-in-law was still pretty angry about the loss of his armada. Elizabeth had been friendly with the Russian Tsar Ivan the Terrible. He had even proposed to her once. But she wanted to talk commerce and he wanted to talk war, and it didn't work out. But now Ivan the Terrible was dead, and his son Fyodor I was Tsar. His father had traded mainly with England. Fyodor had decided that he would trade with anybody. It wasn't just an English thing anymore. And he kicked the English ambassador out of Moscow. Elizabeth was losing friends faster than she was making them. Elizabeth sent a new trade ambassador to demand the Tsar to reconsider. The negotiations failed due to the ambassador addressing Fyodor with two of his many titles omitted. Rookie move. Titles were very important. Just ask Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, the first of her name, Queen of the Andals and the First Men, Protector of the Seven Kingdoms, the Mother of Dragons, the Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, the Unburned, the Breaker of Chains. You can't just drop some of the titles. They're all very important. Elizabeth continued to appeal to Fyodor in half appealing, half reproachful letters. She proposed an alliance, something which she had refused to do when offered one by Fyodor's father. But she was turned down. She didn't have the same effect on Fyodor that she had had on his father. The East India Company was formed to trade in the Indian Ocean region and China, and received a charter from Queen Elizabeth on the 31st of December 1600 for a period of 15 years. The company was awarded a monopoly on English trade with all countries east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan. The company eventually controlled half of the world trade and substantial territory in India in the 18th and 19th century. The period after the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 brought new difficulties for Elizabeth that lasted until the end of her reign. The conflicts with Spain and Ireland dragged on. The tax burden grew heavier, and the economy was hit by poor harvests and the cost of war. Prices rose and the standard of living fell. That is the most relatable thing I've heard in a while. During this time, repression of Catholics intensified, and Elizabeth authorized commissioners in 1591 to interrogate and monitor Catholic householders. To maintain the illusion of peace and prosperity, she increasingly relied on internal spies and propaganda. In her later years, mounting criticism reflect the decline in the public's affection for her. One of the causes for this second reign of Elizabeth, as it's sometimes called, was the changed character of Elizabeth's governing body. The Privy Council in the 1590s, a new generation was now in power, and they were vying for power. No one knew what to expect when the Queen died. They were at war with Spain and Ireland, and not overly popular in Europe because they left the Catholic Church. The Pope and all the Catholic monarchs were no friend of hers. During the last years of her reign, Elizabeth came to rely on granting monopolies as a cost free system of patronage, rather than asking Parliament for more subsidies in a time of war. The practice soon led to price fixing, the enrichment of courtiers, and the public was paying for it. There was widespread resentment. This culminated in agitation in the House of Commons during Parliament of 1601. In her famous Golden Speech, Elizabeth professed ignorance of the abuses and won the members over with promises and her usual appeal to emotions. You can Google the speech, but basically it says, "My bad, guys, I'm just a dumb woman. I had no idea. I'll do better, I promise." The same period of economic and political uncertainty, however, produced an unsurpassed literary flowering in England. During the 1590s, there was this hot new writer at court. He was around 25 and he wrote some pretty cool new stuff. His name was William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare was a big fan of Queen Elizabeth. He wrote history plays about her family. Richard III is a pretty popular one about the villainy of the reign of King Richard III. Some people think this is what got him his bad reputation. And while I agree he probably wasn't as bad as Shakespeare portrayed him, he did have his issues. At best, he lost his royal nephews while he was in charge, and at worst, he killed them. Don't come for me, Richard III Society. In its time, the plays, including Richard III, were history plays about the royal family 250 years in the past. Guys, it's Hamilton. The Broadway play Hamilton is our version of what Shakespeare was then. A contemporary telling of rulers and government from long ago. Now, I'm not saying Lin-Manuel Miranda is our Shakespeare, but Hamilton is really good and you should definitely watch it. The notion of a great Elizabethan era depends largely on the builders, dramatists, poets, and musicians who were active during Elizabeth's reign. They owed little directly to the Queen, who was never a major patron of the arts. She was fun. She liked parties and plays and social functions, but she wasn't usually writing the checks. She did write the checks on occasion. Edmund Spenser collected a payday himself when he portrayed Queen Elizabeth as the eternally youthful fairy queen Gloriana. She wrote the check that time. Her painted portraits became less realistic and more a set of enigmatic icons that made her look much younger than she was. In fact, her skin had been scarred by smallpox, leaving her half bald and dependent on wigs and cosmetics. Her love of sweets and fear of dentists contributed to severe tooth decay and tooth loss to such an extent that foreign ambassadors had a hard time understanding her speech. An ambassador from Henry IV of France reported an audience with the Queen, during which he noticed, "Her teeth are very yellow and unequal, and on the left side less than the right. Many of them are missing, so she cannot be understood easily when she speaks quickly." Yet he added, "Her figure is fair and tall and graceful in whatever she does. So far as may be, she keeps her dignity, yet humbly, graciously, withal." Walter Raleigh called her "a lady whom time had surprised." Despite what had to be the unique appearance of the Queen, her health remained fair until the autumn of 1602, when a series of deaths among her friends had plunged her into severe depression. She was now 68 and probably very much feeling her age. In March of 1603, Elizabeth fell sick and remained in a settled and unremovable melancholy, and sat motionless on a cushion for hours on end. When Robert Cecil told her that she must go to bed, she snapped. "Must is not a word to use to princes, little man." She died on the 24th of March, 1603, at Richmond Palace, between 2 and 3 in the morning. A few hours later, the council set their plans in motion and proclaimed King James of Scotland King of England as well. The Queen is dead. Long live the King. King James VI of Scotland, being descended from King Henry VII, became King James I of England. Elizabeth, not having children, is what united the United Kingdom, although it wouldn't be officially the United Kingdom for a while still. While it has become normative to record Elizabeth's death as occurring in 1603, following the English calendar reform in the 1750s, at the time, England observed New Year's Day on the 25th of March, commonly known as Lady Day, named after the Virgin Mary. Thus, Elizabeth died on the last day of the year 1602 in the old calendar. The modern convention is to use the old style calendar for the day and month while using the new style calendar for the year. She died on her version of New Year's Eve at the age of 69. Elizabeth's coffin was carried downriver at nightfall to Whitehall on a barge lit with torches. At her funeral on the 28th of April, the coffin was taken to Westminster Abbey in a hearse drawn by 4 horses hung with black velvet. Elizabeth was interred in Westminster Abbey in a tomb shared with her half-sister Mary I. The Latin inscription on her tomb translates to, "Consorts in realm and tomb, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in hope of resurrection." And that is where we will leave it for this week. What did you think of Elizabeth I? She's kind of a big deal. Only the second Queen Regnant of England, and her sister Mary was the first. She reigned for 44 years, 127 days. At the time, she was the 5th longest reigning monarch of England. People live longer now, so she's dropped to 9th, but she's still in the top 10. I started this series in the year 1285 with Isabella of France's birth, and we have traveled more than 300 years, over 32 episodes, to the death of Queen Elizabeth I. It's been fun, and this marks the end of season 1. Thank you to everyone who listened to my podcast. It grew into something much larger than I ever imagined it would. And there will be a season 2. For season 2, I'm going to go back in history and cover a different family. So instead of growing longer, the story is going to gain some depth. More texture adds to the tapestry of history, one thread at a time. Join me for season 2, when we will cover Scotland and probably Braveheart and Disney's Brave. And long live to all the queens out there. And until next season, bye.